Great, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to the folks out west. My name is Emery Davidge. I'm one of the co-chairs of ULI Toronto's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and an associate at Urban Strategies here in Toronto. On behalf of ULI Toronto and our committee, I am pleased to welcome you to today's session, Redressing Black Displacement in Canada. As a Toronto-based organization, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. I think it's important for us to acknowledge these lands, their history, and the enduring legacy of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, particularly given how the work we do is so deeply connected to land. And now, more than ever, it's on us to recognize, reflect on, and challenge the role that settler colonialism plays in how our communities are planned, built, and governed. To learn more about the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, I recommend two programs that ULI Toronto recently co-hosted with Shared Path over the last year. 13,000 Years of Indigenous History in the GTA and Why It Matters to Planning and Development, and more recently, Whose Land and Whose Law. The links to both of these sessions will be posted in the chat. Before we start today, we have some basic housekeeping items to go through. So number one, everyone should automatically be on mute, so please check. And we ask that you remain on mute throughout the session to avoid any audio disruptions. Number two, closed captioning is available for this session. There may be a slight delay and it might not be 100% accurate, so please be patient. Number three, the session will have a Q&A segment. If you would like to ask questions of our panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up button. The session is being recorded and will be sent to registrants in the coming days. It will be posted online at ULI's Knowledge Finder platform over the next few weeks. And number five, if you'd like to take the conversation online, please be sure to tag us at ULI Toronto or use the hashtag #AskGreatQuestions. Today's event and all other ULI programming would not be possible without the support of our annual sponsors. I would like to say a major thank you to all of them for their support. ULI Toronto relies on the support of our sponsors who allow us to put on the quality programming we do to drive our mission of creating and sustaining thriving communities. I would like to add an extra special thank you to Brookfield and Ellis Dawn, who are the annual sponsors of ULI Toronto's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. We thank them for their continued support of our committee's activities throughout the year. It's now my pleasure to kick off ULI Toronto's first Black History Month event, as we are committed to providing our membership and guests both access to information and opportunities to engage as we work together to dismantle systemic racism in our communities and institutions. Today, we'll travel across the country to explore the impacts of displacement and urban renewal on Black communities and landmarks across Canada. To launch this discussion, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator today, Camille Mitchell. A highly accomplished architect, Camille brings many years of experience on award-winning projects, garnering recognition for this work through speaking, mentorship, and teaching opportunities. Camille excels at liaising with end users and client groups, seamlessly integrating the expertise of consultants and furthering the design of intelligent and reliable places for natural interaction and individual reflection. Camille believes it is extremely important for underrepresented groups to be involved with the design of their built environments. She is a founding member of the independent organizations Building Equality in Architecture Toronto and the Black Architects and Interior Designer Association. Their programs are dedicated to supporting mentorship, networking, and leadership opportunities for women and visible minorities within the architecture professions. In 2020, Camille was nominated to join the Urban Land Institute's Women in Leadership Initiative Championship team. This initiative was created with a mandate of the advancement of women in real estate development, land use, and city building. As recent incidents of social unrest have become catalysts to evaluate learned behavior and biases within the design industry, Camille was selected to join Gensler's Northeast Regional Diversity Initiative to assist with framing necessary steps to achieving mutual respect and understanding in the workplace. And Camille's involvement with post-secondary institutions includes the Dean's Advisory Council for the Faculty of Engineering and Architectural Science at Ryerson University, and the Advisory Board for the University of Waterloo School of Architecture's Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Program, which provides the guidance and oversight to the school as it revisits its curriculum and launches new initiatives. Camille, I'll be back at around 12:45 to help with the audience Q&A. For now, I'll pass it on to you to introduce this panel and the work we're going to be doing today.
Thank you, Emery, for this beautiful introduction. I think what excited me about this panel discussion is the opportunity to look at Canadian history again. I believe as a Canadian, we've romanticized our Black history in this country, and we've often pivoted ourselves against our American neighbors to the south as better than. So this is opportunity, which I think is important for this real estate and development community, is to take notes, not just listen, but take notes on what they can do within their own circles to affect change. And also be mindful of the stories we've learned and opportunity to unlearn, and be mindful of whose stories we've been telling to ourselves. So we're going to take a travel across Canada in this COVID world. We can do that easily. So we're going to start where a lot of our country started off, is in the East Coast. So we're going to go to Halifax, and I'm going to start with Angela, and we're going to ask each panelist to do an introduction on themselves and speak about the project that we are discussing, and also highlight some trajectories and how they went along their path. So Angela Simmons is the manager of equity and access, and with the Nova Scotia Barrister Society. So Angela, can you explain to us how you got involved with this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Camille, and thanks for inviting me. I'll be brief. I know we're going to have a discussion. So as Camille mentioned, I'm Angela, and I work at the Nova Scotia Barrister Society, and I'm from Cherry Brook in East Preston, and actually live in North Preston now with my husband and 3 children. And so part of this work that I would say, first of all, foremost, is to just acknowledge that African Nova Scotians, in particular, Black people, that Nova Scotia is the Black presence for us. And since we've been here since 1700. And so that's really the beginning of the Land Titles Clarification Act for me, was this involvement and discussion around promised land to, in particular, African Nova Scotians in particular marginalized communities for us, and this reality that the British government in the early 1700s had made promises to Black folks, enslaved people, promising free land, free opportunity, and resources that were available. And so the biggest issue that came to light is that the enslaved people who traveled here and fought in the war did not actually receive title or ownership. And what they received was something called a occupation of license to occupy, which means that you just occupy the land, doesn't actually give you, clear title to your land. And what this problem was is that the neighboring white settlers were given the land that was promised. So all of this to say is that it has been an historical injustice. I guided a lot of my work because I am living in one of the largest Black communities in particular Halifax in Nova Scotia. And so part of this work that I did was really founded in kind of this conversation that I think is really important about Black folks and African Nova Scotians, and that we are a distinct culture, and that we were not settlers in the colonial way, but we were settled here. I don't think that being forced to come over on a ship, being enslaved, is a choice. And so we have been settled in this province. And so part of the work that I do is really just redressing the historical injustices of that. And mindful of the time, I'm gonna wait for questions later. So hopefully that's good. And I apologize for the next person if I went over.
No, you're fine. You're good. Thank you, Angela. We're gonna shift a little more west. So we're gonna stop in Toronto. So I'm also living in Toronto right now, and I'm quite familiar with the intersection of Bathurst and Bloor in downtown Toronto. And this is the location of a different book list. And Aita Sidhu is one of our panelists. She's a founder of a different book list. But Aita is also a dynamic entrepreneur and community developer. And she utilizes her creativity within leadership and teamwork. Because even for myself, I attended a presentation that Aita gave to students through the Lifelong Leadership Institute a few years ago. And what I appreciated was her storytelling of how currently ITA, Sadu, and the different book list is the only development that was previously in the Honest Ed's development with Mirvish that is going to go back to the West Bank development in the future. So ITA, can you share with the audience how you managed to preserve that title?
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. I also want to say straight up, I noted last night about 10 o'clock, it said we were experts, and suddenly I had a moment of panic. I think I'm an expert being a Black woman and a parent of my daughter, so I was slightly freaking out. But I am Ita Sadu, and I am the granddaughter of Fitz Willoughby Walcott, a great architect and out of the nation of Barbados. And so I come to you too out of a tradition of people who have been involved in building things. And in my household, the name Oscar Niemeyer, great Brazilian architect, was a household name. So it is really important too that I enter into this space, coming from a land of mahogany and coming from a land where I saw a country move from colonialism to independence, and where the government intentionally gave people land that were displaced because of the plantation economy. So I wanted to put forward that. And so at the intersection of Bathurst and Bloor is a space for me, is a Black business economic community. It was a place where when I returned to Canada, my mother would take me so that we could hear the sights and sounds and the accents and the food and the services of our community. And so over the years, we were lucky to be the custodians of a bookstore called A Different Book List. And what we are doing here today is not a Black conversation, it's a Canadian conversation. And I also believe that the efforts of A Different Book List as an independent bookstore and out of that independent bookstore has become this organic expression of a cultural center. And I would like to say that what we are doing impacts other independent bookstores in their trajectory into the future as they speak to well-being and wellness. But back to the cultural center. So there was we came to a moment almost in our 20th year of existence where the Mirvish village was closing, no more. And suddenly we were told that a new developer was coming and things were changing. As people of African descent, change is always part of our DNA. And so we had to think, how are we going to embrace this change? Again, as people who have been in community trenches, attending so many meetings around the city, looking at other spaces approaching redevelopment or gentrification, the question to us was, how do we enter this space of redevelopment? And so the first thing that we looked at was the name of the developer. And that name excited us. It was Gillespie. And so that made us that reminded us of Dizzy Gillespie. And so we approached this development into the movement of dance. We were going to come into this development, not to be scared to talk to a developer or about development, but we were going to be bold because we came with history. We came from places where we have done great things. So this was a new and exciting conversation for us to enter in, knowing that on Bathurst Street at the Bathurst and Bloor intersection, we just not only lived in that community, but we also had a very vibrant and practicing and active business community. And so today we are now in the process of developing a permanent home so that we can plant roots permanently into this land. I am very pleased that Canada Post right now in its new stamp this year is celebrating two communities long in this country, Amberville in Alberta and Willow Grove in New Brunswick. So it seems fitting that we are having this conversation today along land, around displacement of people. It seems as though we are at a pivotal intersection of not just talking anymore, but being active. And I thank you again, because when I look at you, I see youth and I see young people. And so I believe that we are now on the cusp of now engaging some new ideas and also looking at the world through different lenses.
Thank you, Ita. Before we move along further west, I just wanted to do a pit stop in my hometown of Hamilton, Ontario, because it's a shared hometown of myself and Stephanie. So if I have an opportunity to mention Hamilton, I will. So that's it. Steel City. And there, we're going to go all the way to Vancouver now. Thank you for waking up and joining us at this time. To Stephanie Allen. Stephanie Allen is a founding board member of Hogan's Alley Society, and she's also the Associate Vice President of Strategic Business Operations and Performance for BC Housing. Welcome, Stephanie.
Good morning, everyone, and a great, memory back to Hamilton, and hi to any folks from Hamilton who might be listening in. Still my favorite place in Canada. I want to recognize that this morning I'm talking to all of you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, the first peoples of this lands who have had their lands, their existence and their lives marginalized through colonization. And I also say that as a descendant of African people who were brought to this hemisphere against their will, who were enslaved and forced to be in these lands. As a descendant of people working against colonialism, I really recognize that we have to be committed to working in good relations with Indigenous peoples on these lands. So a real pleasure to talk to you all. My background is as a real estate developer. I've worked in the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, and now in government. My career spans about 19 years in Western North America. And as someone who has worked so long in that industry, I can speak with authority by saying that this is an industry that is definitely rooted in and founded upon white supremacy. And the work that I'm talking about when I talk about white supremacy is not the violent kind that we saw storm the Capitol, but the systemic kind, the kind that has ordered people and put certain power structures in place that favor some and disadvantage others. And that is the story of Hogan's Alley. Hogan's Alley was a Black community that formed in the late 1800s, early 1900s at the area of Vancouver where most racialized people were allowed to live. I say allowed to live because there were absolutely systemic barriers in land use policy, deeply rooted in land use policy that we borrowed from the United States to set up our cities that put wealthy white landowners on large properties in certain areas and lower income racialized people in smaller tracts of housing located to the less desirable areas of town. Now, this community flourished for a time. And Black folks who lived here had a bustling little community. There was a church that had 800 members at its peak. There was Vi's Chicken and Steaks, where you would find the top names of Black entertainment that would come through this city at the after hours spot. You see Ella Fitzgerald and Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, this is a place of really wondrous accomplishments and people and community. And unfortunately, because of that existence, because of their Blackness, they were targeted for displacement. Sometimes when we think about displacement, displacement doesn't always have a planned place for you to go. It just wants you out. And that was the case with Hogan's Alley. This was a Black community that was targeted through land use policy for eviction. Now, some of us in the Black community, many years later, the city of Vancouver have targeted this area for big redevelopment. We put up our hands and said, this should be a community land trust that should hold these assets in community hands, and that the city of Vancouver should not profit from these lands. So looking forward to talking a little bit more about how we talk about land trust, community-owned assets as a way of disrupting the white supremacy that has continued to marginalize our people and keep us impoverished. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. So one of the first thoughts or memories I had was like roughly 5 years ago. I made a trip out to Halifax and I went to look for Africville because I knew about Africville. I had gone to Halifax 20 years before then and looked for Africville. And to even get there, it was a really disjointed adventure. There weren't no direct trips, no direct routes. And when you arrive there, it was, I think they just had a mock-up of one of the churches, but the rest of the area is leveled. And that's what I was introduced to North Preston. And not knowing of this community, and I think it's one of your comments, Angela, is that this community is really unknown to us. But at the same trip, I made a trip out to Prince Edward Island, and I saw how with the cruise ships coming from Boston at the time, how cruise ships would find their way across the island to Anne of Green Gables, which is a fictional book, and how at the same time that area is protected federally, I believe provincially and municipally by all levels of government, while Africville is leveled and half of it has turned into a dog park. So my question, Angela, you're on mute. My question is to all of you, and feel free to jump in, is do land rights help to protect these areas, or does it provide an additional level of complexity? And what about all these forgotten areas of Canada? And is the term forgotten correct? Because I know these communities are still vibrant, but even within Canadian history, in our own education and history lessons, we're not often talked about.
Yes. So I think for me, just and again, in my own opinion, I think part of the legislation that has enacted, the LTCA, definitely, I think the legislation and which guides us is great, but it's the people actually behind the scenes who keep enforcing and kind of interpreting these policies and legislation in the wrong way, which continues to marginalize and oppress certain communities, in particular African Nova Scotian communities. And to your point about Africville, you know, government thinks that it did a wonderful thing by giving, you know, parts of Uniacke Square, which we know is Uniacke Square, and when you take a group of people and then center them in a different location, and then they have to continuously rent and never own, is actually very different than owning a house and community property in Africville. There's no ownership of anyone who has been displaced from Africville. And so similarly with the community of North Preston, and I would speak, there's, you know, 13 other areas, but again, my passion lies in North Preston just because of my own historical roots, and because I do believe it is still such an oppressed community. You know, the bus route between going to North Preston to even get to the city is over an hour. So those just talk about the resources that just aren't even available, of no sidewalks, because this community is so displaced. One way in, one way out is a huge and still continues to be problematic for our youth and for even the growth of any kind of ownership. And to what Stephanie had mentioned earlier in terms of this community land trust, I think it's a real opportunity for us, for Black folks, to kind of own something and then be able to leave it generationally and be able to still be successful by the same way that flourishing white communities are. And those are just some of my, I'll let other people speak, sorry.
Yes. Yes, to echo that, I guess I'm quoting you, Angela, because one of your comments was that it's not a human rights issue, it's a it's not just simply a property issue, it's a human rights issue. And there are a series of initiatives, even here in Toronto, that are encouraging land ownership. And because there's often a lot of developments for rentals that cater to the Black community or other marginalized communities. But with new developments, how can we guide developers with urban renewal to be more mindful of purchasing land so that we can start affecting change for generational wealth?
You know, I would love to just pivot off what Angela said to respond to that. And when I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I saw that what slavery was, it was a rights-based property ownership system. We have inherited and continue to live in a rights-based property ownership system that has always excluded us. We were the mortgageable interest in the founding of these lands, when land had no conceived value, when they were just exterminating Indigenous people off their lands. The land wasn't mortgageable, our lives were. So when we think about what we're trying to transform, and why a community land trust is something we're interested in, is because we know that even if we get enough Black folks owning homes, which I think we should, it still doesn't have access in a system of capitalism, because there's still going to be poor people in a capitalist society. That's just a reality. It's an output of the inputs. So if people are going to continue to have that disadvantage through poverty, my question is, why do we want to continue to see, property rights be the foundation we stand on, when property rights can be taken away from us, which has happened in Hogan's Alley, which has happened in other areas, because they can use other mechanisms. So I agree that developers that are putting projects together need to work in community and look at how those assets are being, kept in perpetuity. But I think it's really policymakers that have got to hold these frameworks in place to make sure that communities have those benefits. Otherwise, they will not benefit.
I'm going to jump in and weigh in my 2 cents on this.
Yes.
I think even one of the first things that I find problematic, and I remember when the notion of land trust came upon us with the cultural center as an option, would you explore this notion called land trust? And I remember the first thought that I had in the room was how freely people could talk about land trusts that were were non-Black or not racialized people. And this land trust thing seemed to be a secret that was being discussed in other areas, but it was not part of our everyday conversation in the community. My mother always says that Canadians have a polite racism. I will send you a plate of food, but please do not move next door to me. And then when we entered into the conversation of the land trust, there was always the notion that we wouldn't understand the complexity of this huge thing. So from the get-go, you're faced with a barrier. And that barrier, and it was important for me to start today to tell you my background in Barbados, because when we enter into a space immediately, you're confronted with the barriers. You're not part of this world. You don't really know. You don't have the expertise. Where are your resources? All these things. So even to get going in the conversation, it is almost you have to drag that chair to the table, bring all the other lawn chairs with you at the same time to show people that you have the capacity, the intelligence, and the intellect to even enter into the conversation. I'm going to give you a simple example about space. As a bookstore, as a person who sells books, I remember the day when we first got to the big trade fair, and one of the big trade fairs that sells books to all of the teacher librarians here in the Toronto District School Board, the largest school board in this country. And we are people of color, probably the only people of color in the entire trade space. And finally, we hit that mark and we got in there. And they placed us next to a door, a cold door in the dead of winter. Boy, it was cold. It was crappy real estate. But the spirit of Africa and Black people warmed up that spot. Progressive teachers supported us. Here's the thing. The next year that we went back, did we get that spot? No, it became a prime time spot. And so we got regulated to the back of the trade fair room, next to another very cold door. It's important that I say this. And once again, the spirit of Africa and progressive allies or comrades came and supported us, and we had a buzz. The next year we came back, what happened? That spot became even more prime time now. And on it went. All the people who were on the trade floor for the last 3,000 years still had the same spot. But here come people of African descent, bold into capitalism, to be now sellers and distributors of books. And every single step of the way, we are marginalized because of this thing called the acquisition of space, even on a trade floor. So we talking big, complex land trust and the ownership of land and development, but in a micro level, even on a trade space, your ability to access space. And when you have demonstrated your practice in the space, then you are displaced to another place and you have to almost start all over again. That's what we are dealing with. So one of the key things in all of this conversation here is to respect the resources, the expertise, and the intelligence that we bring into the conversations. That's the first place we got to start. We can have all kinds of conversations among ourselves, but when we come into a room, we cannot be seen as charitable, as less than, or as somebody giving us a handout. So I'm pleased today that we are located in a Canadian conversation about Blackness and not a Black conversation in Canada.
Thank you, Aita. So with all your projects, what would validation mean to you? Because I understand that we're not done yet, and this is a comment and a question that other communities can learn across this country. It's not necessarily specific to Black communities, but what is validation? What is acknowledgement? And not necessarily is there a timeline, but how do we achieve that for our Black communities across Canada?
And go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ida. Go ahead.
I believe it is in the individuals that you're working with, what they hear, what you are saying, and it's the conversation that you're having. I remember, and I'm going to give an example, the ERA architects, and they've just popped into my head. And there's an officer there by the name of Alexa Cohen. And I remember when we first met her and her talking about heritage and the Mirvish village and redevelopment, what I listened to was a new voice. She was willing to listen to us. She was willing to hear our story, our concerns, our fears, and our challenges. No pushback. Anything that we suggested to her, she found a way to accommodate into her plans, into her proposals. She represented this big old company who is known all over the world for the great things that they do. But it took an officer, one individual, to just get that ball rolling because she listened. She saw us. She wasn't a liberal coming to lead us into the promised land, but she saw that this journey with us was going to be one where we could journey together. And I would say too, with the officers of West Bank, that has been our experience, whether they're the individual people who are progressive in their hearts and in their thinking, but it starts with the individuals. Final piece I'm going to say, I called a developer the other day and I was appointed to the Office of Diversity and Equity. The person was new, but immediately she sent me to speak to the Black people and the Black committee and the Black group in her corporation. I was a little freaked out about that. No, we were called to speak to you, not to Black people. We can speak to them in our community. Good on you that you've got the Black group. But in that moment, we want to be validated that we can speak to the power that exists in your corporation and not be relegated to go to speak to the Black people who are going to tell us that now they have to go to speak to you to give us the answers. So when I'm talking about feeling validated, it's about being listened to. And the next time that you come with your proposal and your plan, we have seen that you have incorporated our thinking. We have seen that you have listened to our recommendations and you're doing something to act on them, but you're not just leading us blindly. That's, for me, is that validation. You really see us and you really hear us. And in no time at all, I feel that I'm an angry Black woman. And in no time at all, I want to keep having conversations with you where I repeatedly reoppress myself. So then that makes me tired. Yeah.
Thank you. Stephanie or Angela?
Yeah, I mean, Angela, I think you were going to go ahead so I can finish up after.
No, you go ahead. No.
Sure. I mean, I think what I think, our experience has been is that we actually need the resources and the power to determine our own solutions. It can no longer just be a seat at someone else's table where the entire thing was built before we got there. I think what you see when you talk about community land trust, and just to make a note, community land trust started in North America by Black people in Georgia. It was a civil rights movement to recognize that Black farmers and Black people were being pushed off their lands through terrorism, right? Through the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. So when we go to the roots of land trust, it's recognizing that we come from our ancestry, which is communalism. We believe in interdependence. We believe in having those social networks that we survive on. And as displaced peoples that have now descended many hundreds of years in these lands, we recognize that we need a place to call home. We need a place to shelter from some of the ways that we continue to be excluded. Now, absolutely, I want listeners to think about how their organizations are decolonizing, how their organizations are working to support community. But I think we've got to get our heads around the fact that we want to determine the solutions ourselves. We want Black organizations in this country to be founded and run by ourselves with our lenses, with our approaches to working in community, with our, principles and values that support our own needs, because we know what they are best. And so when we look at the community, I mean, we're asking the city of Vancouver for an entire city block in the most extensive city in the world. We know the value of the lands that they kicked us off of, decades ago. But we want to create something that's not for profit, but that's social enterprise driven, that gives all the entrepreneurial experiences, that gives affordable, great homes for people that they can live in generationally. But we recognize that that's a barrier to an institution like the City of Vancouver, which is deeply colonial. So we're fighting something that people can't get their heads around because they think if they could hire some Black folks into their organizations, that's enough. It's not enough. Let us build our organizations, seed our organizations to grow, and give us the resources to determine our own solutions. I think that's the kind of thing we need all these organizations to think about in a much deeper way.
Yeah, I feel a lot similar to what Stephanie has said. I mean, for me, in terms of validating, and again, comes from my work and my experience, I definitely think that the 2.7 million that was designated and given by government to support this work of the LTCA, not once did it include the 5 years of the people on the ground, the grassroots approach. And so I think we can't begin to have these conversations with property developers or this conversation about ownership in marginalized communities without talking about anti-Black racism, without the intersection of our education, how we apply for jobs, how their job descriptions even go out. Are we getting the right people? Where do we place all of this important work and knowledge? I mean, one thing that we do know is we've been here, we are resilient in what we do, and you cannot continue to ask us to join the table, which what Stephanie said is you already have everything in place. You're just really asking us to join to say, okay, right? You don't really want to listen to what we're saying. You don't want to listen to the contributions. And so for me, part of the work that we did validating means that you include the people who were there before, right? You don't just hire a certain department and then exclude community. And for me, it really did divide a community with this government awarded funded project, was because the people who were involved were never asked. And then I became the voice, but all the community grassroots people that I said, this is who we need to contact, were not once informed. And so I think it becomes problematic. And then again, I think it's part of government's way to divide us in the work that we do. So validation means that you include from the beginning of the conversation and not at the end. And I believe that these things can only happen when we dismantle the policies and the processes that have been created against us constantly, that are still entrenched with racism. And in particular, against Black and Brown people in this country, in this province. I think, one of the things that all of these conversations are come about with George Floyd, that is not an isolated incident. These events have been happening over and over again, but now it seems that it's, I'll take the platform for these conversations, but it needs to go further than that. Like once people are feeling like they feel comfortable and, white folks are so happy, they're helping people, that I think we still need to continue the conversation. And so anyway, I think a lot of work needs to be done.
Yes, and this is probably one of my final questions. How has the over-policing of Black communities affected your work, and also even getting to the table, the proverbial table to begin with? Is there rejections or the notion of the existence of these Black communities? Is there resistance to the redevelopment of such? Going forward.
Sorry. I'll just speak brief on it, because I do feel like the community that I am in, this past weekend, there's been a post about a death in North Preston being this worst place possible, the most violent, community here in Canada. And so what I would say is what policing Black lives does is continues to stereotype, continues to oppress Black people, and the reality of living beyond in poverty still. I think the reality that we're never really, I think this was alluded to before, is that, we're not considered even knowledgeable. We're not considered experts in the work that we know. And so policing Black lives, in particular here, and I think everywhere, I think it's a broader conversation. And again, until we dismantle the system, you can have as many initiatives as you want until you start to break down the training that needs to happen. It needs to be a different form of training. This idea that, to arrest people without and arbitrarily because someone has suspicious activity is really problematic for me. But again, that's now the law part coming in. So we'll go back to the other conversation about how it's impacting people. But I'll let Stephanie and you to speak. I don't want to speak for everyone.
Yeah, I can say that, when we just implemented a race question in British Columbia for the homeless count, the point in time count, and we found that Black people in the Metro Vancouver region are 3.7 times overrepresented in the homeless population. When we think about the convergence of race and poverty, and the fact that Black communities existing on their own terms in Canada remains inconceivable. That's a quote from Jennifer Nelson, who's wrote about Africville. Like these things converge, and create situations where our lives are continuously surveilled and monitored and criminalized. And that happened from foundation, right? From when we were first brought to these lands, either as enslaved people or when after slavery was abolished and we were supposed to be able to move within the Commonwealth, and Canada immediately put up immigration policies to restrict our movement to these lands and used all kinds of violent means to keep us from these lands. We've been unwelcomed, except in the form of servitude, since settlers came here. So when we think about that, our existence and our self-determination, whether we're in an affluent neighborhood and we belong there, but we're pulled over because we shouldn't live there, or whether we live in social housing and the police constantly surveil those areas. Policing and housing is a major kind of area of inquiry that we've got to talk about in this country, and that we don't, that the not-for-profits, the government sectors that fund affordable housing have not been engaging with. And I think we've really got to start unpacking that, because the well-being of children, the well-being of our elders, the well-being of young people and working people really does matter, that they have a sense of safety. And right now, the money that's being funneled into law enforcement is not being funneled into our communities. We're not getting a fraction of that money. So how do we think about servicing and supporting communities in a different way so that we actually can have tools and mechanisms to support those of us that are struggling? If you exclude people from the economy formally, they resort to things to survive. We can't expect people not to steal a bike when they're homeless if we haven't given them enough money to live, if we haven't given them the things that they need and the medicine that they need. So we've got to think about the fact that we are building these structures, we reinforce these structures, and then we wonder why things aren't working for people. It's got to change.
Police and Black lives. I live in Lawrence Heights community, and I'm looking at it right now. And yesterday or the day before was such a beautiful day, and it was quiet. And there were 5 cruisers. 5 cruisers. Why are 5 cruisers? Every weekend, every day, 1 million cruisers, 1 million police parked all over the place. That alone is intimidation. Bathurst and Bloor is an iconic intersection. It is not a marginalized community. Yonge and Bloor, Bathurst and Bloor, Jane and Finch. These are great intersections that are known in the city. When our Black youth came to the center, and they came in numbers, one of their tenants or 3 of the tenants in the condos upstairs called the police, made complaints all the time. Every time the young people showed up, they're too noisy. Some days they were not even talking. Some days they were not even saying anything, but they were being policed, just the sheer presence of that. And here's the thing too, the impact that it has on our children. At the cultural center, one week, I stood outside every day and watched students go into Central Tech. Lots of Black kids, lots of Black youth, a lot of Black males. And I asked them this question: you pass here every day and you never come in. Why is that? It's a Black space. What do you think? You're welcome here. Why don't you come through? And this is what those students told me. Miss, it is nice. What do you mean by that? It is nice, miss. So somewhere too in the psyche of our young people, they're being told that good is not good for them. Nice is not good for them. They have to go into a place which is clinical with signs that says, are you unemployed? Do you need help? Are you down and out? Are you downtrodden? Things that oppress your spirit and never lift it up. And then you get the sign, welcome to whatever the community center is. So our tenants upstairs in the building were just automatically policing young Black people because they saw them coming into the center. When we had adults come into the center, they didn't police them like that, but they were already prepared to put our young people in check. The great Dudley Laws, the activist, the man with the beret and one of the most photographed men in this world, lived in my house. And he lived in my home. And 2 days later, when my neighbor realized that the Black beret was a statement that spoke truth to power and to the police in this country, and I will go on record for this, my neighbor put up a for sale sign on their homes. And my neighbor proceeded to tell me that it used to be a safe neighborhood because of one man who was courageous enough to wear that beret and to speak truth to power. That's how policed we are. My neighbors sold their home in a month. They never even left their homes because one Black man lived in my house. On January the 6th, when we saw those people storm the Capitol, this is the message that the whole world saw, and this is what impacts us all as African people living in North America. They stormed because the Negro, and I will use this language today, the Negro should never be allowed to vote. If they vote, it will not only improve their condition in life, their access to land, because we all know and we have said at one point in time, you had to be white, a gentleman, a particular age to own land. But their storming also said this: as Christian racists, insurgents, extremists, Ku Klux Klan people, we need to go to bed with the Bible. And the way we will sleep well at night is because the Negro is not human. See, we also face that. So when people stormed that government and showed the world that they don't even see us in 2021 as human, not just about voting to improve our lives, but now we would be human. How do we respond to that? In Canada, you are not off the hook with it either, because those tenants upstairs policed all those young people and have young people believing that even when we present great organizations and spaces to them, even as Black-led, they still have difficulty coming through the doors because somebody has put in the water and in their DNA that they are not good for the best.
Thank you, Aita. We're going to move to some questions from our audience. Thank you all for your comments so far. So, Emery?
Hi, just catching up on the questions. I'm going to start with this one. It says, thank you for your honesty and passion. Is there a rule also for developers to create space for Black-owned businesses rather than large retail chains in development?
Yeah, we're dealing with a developer right now in Vancouver that is going through a redevelopment of a historic Black site, historically owned site, where the Vise Chicken and Steaks was. And because we couldn't retain those assets, it's now in private hands. No heritage designation, of course, for Black assets. But what the developer's done and we asked for was a right of first refusal for one of the commercial retail units on the ground floor so that we may curate and find a Black owned enterprise that can go into that space and be successful there. Again, these are kind of micro disruptions, but accumulation of those over time can help. And so that's what our land trust is trying to focus on, is how can we grow these assets within a community-owned, membership-based ownership structure that leverages the existing frameworks, but allows for Black ownership, allows for prosperity, and prevents any future displacement.
And again, in our case, when we talk about the cultural center is people, it's a lot of people. And in our efforts along the way, we have been working with entrepreneurs forever. And so it was important for us to update them on the progress of the project that is taking place at Bathurst and Bloor, to say to them, get yourself on the list, to attend as many meetings as possible so that you can be also part of a development so that we can create to a critical mass. In terms of the cultural center itself, we also see that as a place where entrepreneurs can come in. And yes, profit and for-profit must reside within the cultural complex because it helps us with sustainability. All nonprofits together, we're going to die. And in terms of affordable housing for all those students, on in particular our seniors to also continue spreading the word and doing that advocacy, that there's an opportunity coming and you need to sign up now. Don't wait, don't wait, don't wait. It is now. So it is important for us to encourage our entrepreneurs in whatever sectors that they're in, to see this development coming, to see it as a place that they can be and get themselves on the list, but not only on the list, but to get yourselves engaged with the conversations that will make the decisions so that you can participate there. That's important for us as a unit going forward.
Angela, do you have anything
Oh,
about another?
I was just going to say one of the things I think also would be helpful is just to invest. You know, part of these properties that we speak about are not really considered assets, are not really worthy to develop. So I would say invest with Black folks and organizations that maybe want to build or open up certain communities, open up opportunities, open up spaces where people can go, even for just to have a store. You know, certain kind of, we think about recreational areas. You know, the only thing we think about sometimes with Black folks is, you know, basketball or a sport. Well, why don't we put libraries in places? Like, why don't we encourage different things, thinking outside the box? So I think part of investing in not just a community, but in an idea of, you know, better Canada, better Halifax, better people, and that we talk about diversity, but let's really include everyone, right? We know this country is diverse already. What we don't do is include everyone. We don't make things an opportunity for all folks. And so I would say investing and making sure that people are leading those conversations.
And Angela, something that you said just made a bell in my mind. And I know that governments and developers and the whole world always struggle with this thing, the risk. Doing business with us is a risk. You got to remove that out of your equation. It is also a risk for us to do business with you. Mm-hmm. If we go and we tell our people that you're on side and you're going to do the good thing, the right thing, because history has called you to this moment, and you default on us, then it is the risk on our reputations. When we bring you into our community, it is a risk that we are doing that because we are on the line. So the accountability and the risk don't settle with us. It's a two-way conversation, this element of the risk that you are taking. Here is the risk. You have seen us demonstrate all our lives. We have even breastfed your children. There is no risk here. What we are saying now, this is the time to act. And I want to say, though, it is really important to say that there is a level of another generation. Maybe they're the people of the Black Lives Matter generation, comrades and allies, who are determined to work with us to show a different world. So I want to give them props to and big up. And it is not all doom and gloom. Yes, they're the resistors. Yes, they're the people who are going to hold space. We know them. We know them. But it is really, really important that we also to work closely as much as possible with people who have demonstrated that they share a common interest with us and we are not at risk or risk with them. Really important, this notion of taking risk with Black people.
Yeah, and just to speak to that, sorry, and then I'll go to another question, sorry. It's just, it really, you know, something resonated when you, even in particular for private developers, and I say this because, you know, me and my husband moved back to community of North Preston to make sure that, you know, we're fighting and being part of a community that we can actually be entrenched in. And so part of this is a private developer, which I have no idea how can they own rights in North Preston, a community that was, we go back to the 1700s, but it keeps getting smaller and smaller. All that to say, this private developer, we've been in court now for probably the last 3 years because he will not continue to develop on a private road because it's considered North Preston. So as developers, you need to be mindful of the communities that you enter, who it's going to be impacting. You know, we talk about community land trust. If there was a private developer that was committed to a community like North Preston, you would already be building homes and then selling them at a reasonable rate in terms of how we're going to grow and flourish and a community to be even stronger. We talk about why our communities are dying because we're leaving, because there's no opportunity. And so, you know, that's a bit more personal for me because I do get quite angry when I think about property developers and how Black folks and someone like myself, who I would consider, you know, very resourceful. I'm privileged to have a law degree. My husband is a superintendent with Halifax Regional Police, and yet we can't get resources and services because we live in North Preston on a private developer's lane. So that's is problematic. And so I'm not calling certain people out, but you have to be mindful of where you take up space.
Thank you for that. We only have 2 minutes. So this is, I'm going to the last question here, and it's an action question. So if everybody just wants to think about this. From the displacement seen in Regent Park to the gentrification happening in Jane Finch and similar communities right now, what can citizens do to help with efforts in keeping and or reclaiming lands and space while uplifting the overall conditions in these areas? It's a big question, and I'm sorry we don't have a ton of time.
I can say that in Vancouver, we would not have made the impressions we've made if it weren't for broader community support for a community land trust. This is a city where over half of the people are renters, where the notion of secured rental is a desperate thing because people are rent evicted. There's a lot of insecurity in renting. And so when we took our message of a community-owned, Black-led land trust that would hold these spaces, a cultural center, affordable housing, affordable commercial spaces, you know, all of the infrastructure, childcare. We had broad support because I think it's an idea people can get behind. And so the letters to the city, the letters to council that I know, Emery, I think you probably helped screen some of those. It was a bombardment. It was a deluge. And I think when they start to get the political pressure, that's when policy moves. I think we all have to recognize that bureaucrats, and I'm one, we don't wake up one morning and say, you know who we've been excluding? We really got to go help those folks over there. It's the pressure from community. And we need a critical mass because Black folks are still in places like Vancouver, only 1% of the population. We're not a political, you know, constituent that people care about. So when you want to make these moves, we're making these moves. We need that support. We need those letters. We thank you for your donations. It helps our organizations grow. And when you're doing your work and you're looking at building your organizations, think about how you can seed ours. Think about what supports, what administration back end, what technical expertise, because we don't just need jobs. I mean, we do need jobs, folks need jobs, but we want to actually have the capacity to build our own. We want things that we lead and direct ourselves. So I think it's also about that, about how you're engaging in this decolonization work, really.
Thank you. I think we're actually at time. I hate to cut it off. I wish we had another hour or 2 or 3 to have this conversation.
Keep going.
Everybody's
booked.
I don't know.
Everybody's booked on the minute.
But I think what this speaks to is this is going to be the first of many conversations like this one. I think this is, I think we see here there's an opportunity to keep this conversation going. So on behalf of ULI Toronto, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thanks, Camille, for moderating. It was amazing. Stephanie, Aita, Angela, I'm so glad we got to hear you. To all our members and guests, thanks for joining us today. I hope you're all safe and staying safe, and we'll see you on a future webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.